My name is Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
Miss Marple had always felt a peculiar satisfaction in the quiet rhythms of village life. Yet even in her peaceful haven of St. Mary Mead, there were moments that stirred her curiosity and tested her powers of observation. On that mild spring morning, she found herself seated in her favorite armchair, a cup of steaming tea resting on the side table beside her, while the sunlight filtered softly through lace curtains. The room, though modest, carried a warmth that was distinctly hers. Every object, every piece of furniture, bore the subtle mark of a life carefully curated, where nothing was out of place and every detail mattered. Yet as she rocked gently, she felt a faint tug of anticipation, a subtle itch that whispered that the ordinary was about to be disrupted. It came in the form of her friend, Elspeth McGillicuddy, whose sharp features were flushed with agitation. Elspeth, a woman of brisk efficiency and habitual composure, rarely displayed nervousness, but today she seemed nearly breathless, as though she had hurried across miles of thought and distance to reach Miss Marple's sitting room. "Jane," she began, using Miss Marple's first name with a kind of urgent intimacy reserved for the rare occasions when she needed help. "You must listen carefully to what I have to tell you. I've seen something dreadful, something no one else has seen." Miss Marple regarded her friend with the calm scrutiny that had served her well over decades of quietly unraveling human behavior. "Dreadful, you say? Do sit down, Elspeth, and tell me exactly what happened," she said in her soft, unhurried voice, noting the trembling of her friend's hands and the flush in her cheeks. There was fear there, yes, but also precision. Elspeth's mind had captured something she could not forget. Settling into the chair opposite Miss Marple, Elspeth recounted her journey on the train from Paddington, a journey she had undertaken with the usual aimless curiosity of a London excursion. She had been reading lightly, but had glanced up from time to time, noting the placid scenery rushing past, the neat gardens of suburban houses, the occasional cow in a field, the delicate interplay of shadows on the meadows. It was then, as the train passed a certain stretch where the line skirted a remote hillside, that she had glimpsed something she could scarcely believe. Across the tracks in the half-light of a drawing-room window she had seen a man, struggling, arguing, or perhaps defending himself. But the details were lost in a fleeting moment. What she did see, unmistakably, was the culmination of violence. A man struck down in the quiet of a domestic interior, a silent witness to a terrible event. Miss Marple listened intently, her mind quietly cataloging every detail, noting the phrasing Elspeth used, the intervals of hesitation, the precise wording of what she had glimpsed. She knew the value of minute details, the angle of the window, the time of day, the position of furniture, the direction of the sun. All could provide a framework for understanding events that might otherwise seem incomprehensible. "Tell me, Elspeth," she said gently, "was there anyone else present in that room?" Elspeth shook her head. "No, I could see no one else. But Jane, I could feel something, a presence though absent. And there was a certain precision in the way it happened, almost as if the perpetrator had planned everything down to the last moment." Miss Marple's sharp mind began to assemble the fragments of evidence she now held. She thought not only of the incident itself, but of the practicalities, the train's speed, the position of the window, the line of sight from the carriage, and the sheer improbability of anyone noticing a murder through such a brief, transitory glimpse. Yet she had learned long ago that improbable occurrences often concealed essential truths. What mattered most was the reliability of the witness, and Miss Marple trusted Elspeth's clarity of vision implicitly. "I believe you, Elspeth," Miss Marple said, her voice calm, measured, and yet imbued with a rare urgency. "And we must proceed carefully. You must not speak of this to anyone else for the moment, not until we understand more. But I promise you I shall look into it. We will uncover what has happened here step by step." Elspeth nodded, relief mingled with the shadow of continuing fear. "I cannot stop thinking about it, Jane. Every time I close my eyes, I see that room, that moment, that man." Her voice trailed, and Miss Marple, understanding the depth of her friend's distress, allowed silence to hang for a moment, knowing that it often spoke more than words. Once Elspeth had left, Miss Marple remained seated, hands folded in her lap, her mind a whirl of possibilities. She considered the simplest scenarios first: a domestic quarrel gone tragically wrong, a robbery turned fatal, or perhaps a calculated murder within the domestic sphere. Her experience had taught her that the most ordinary surroundings often concealed the most extraordinary motives, and that the outward calm of a household frequently masked the tensions and animosities within. She began making a mental list of the questions that would need answers. Who might have had motive? What opportunities existed? What evidence could be gleaned from the physical scene? And, crucially, what could be learned from the patterns of human behavior, the habits, the alibis, and the subtle inconsistencies that only a careful observer could detect? Each thought connected to the next, weaving a careful map through the labyrinth of human nature, one that would eventually lead her to the truth. That evening, as the last light of day faded across the village, Miss Marple walked slowly through her garden, the cool spring air brushing against her face. She reflected not only on the incident Elspeth had witnessed, but also on the wider implications of a crime committed in secrecy, yet observed from afar. How often did a single moment seen by a single witness hold the key to unraveling a mystery that might otherwise remain hidden? She smiled faintly to herself, a smile tinged with the satisfaction of the detective's instinct. The game was afoot, and she, in her quiet, unassuming way, would play it with patience, insight, and an unerring eye for detail. Night fell, and Miss Marple retired to her bed, her thoughts still racing. She knew that the days ahead would demand careful observation, strategic inquiry, and delicate persuasion. She would need to speak to Elspeth again, learn more about the journey, trace the line of sight, and consider the broader context of the household where the crime had taken place. The threads were there, subtle yet compelling, waiting to be woven together into a coherent tapestry that would reveal both motive and culprit. In her heart she felt the thrill of anticipation, the satisfaction of a challenge worthy of her intellect, a puzzle that demanded not only reasoning but empathy, patience, and an understanding of human nature in all its contradictions. The morning after Elspeth's unsettling confession, Miss Marple awoke with the clarity of one accustomed to untangling human complexities. The world outside her window was bright and serene, a stark contrast to the shadowy thread of violence now woven into her thoughts. Birds sang, flowers swayed in the gentle breeze, and the village stirred with the ordinary rhythm of life, oblivious to the intrigue that had so suddenly crept into their midst. Yet for Miss Marple the calm was deceptive. She knew that where ordinary appearances prevailed, secrets often festered beneath the surface, concealed in plain sight by those who most wished them unnoticed. She dressed with meticulous care, her mind already turning over the sequence of events from the previous day. Elspeth's testimony, though precise and earnest, presented its own complications. The details she had noted, the position of the train, the timing of the glimpse, the subtle movement in the window, were fragments that, while significant, were far from a complete picture. Each fragment, however, held the potential to reveal much if approached with patience and discernment. Miss Marple had learned through decades of careful observation that the smallest details could unravel even the most carefully constructed deceptions. As she walked through the quiet lanes toward her small village shop, she considered her next steps. Elspeth, though reliable, was but a single witness, and a witness's memory could be capricious. She would need corroboration, another perspective, evidence that aligned with what had been seen from that fleeting vantage point. The challenge lay in connecting the moment she had observed from the train to the wider context of the household, a task complicated by the layers of family dynamics, social expectations, and the often impenetrable veil of domestic routine. By mid-morning she had made her decision. A discreet inquiry would be necessary, one that would neither alarm the household nor tip off any individual who might already be sensitive to scrutiny. Miss Marple knew that in families, as in human nature generally, there were those who instinctively sensed questions, and those who inadvertently betrayed themselves by trying too hard to conceal truth. Her skill lay in identifying those subtle signals, the twitch of a hand, the hesitation in speech, the slight misalignment between word and expression. These were the tools she had mastered over a lifetime, and she would employ them now with patient precision. She visited Elspeth once more, this time with a small notebook and an assortment of gentle questions designed to extract every possible nuance from her memory. Together, they retraced the train journey from the initial departure at Paddington to the precise stretch of countryside where the sighting had occurred. Elspeth's recollections, though initially hesitant, grew more vivid with Miss Marple's careful guidance. She described the angle of the window, the faint glint of something metallic on a table, the posture of the man she had glimpsed, and most importantly, the sudden, irrevocable violence of the act itself. Miss Marple listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or prompting with a single word, allowing Elspeth to speak freely. By the end of their discussion, she had sketched a mental map of the scene, noting the likely positions of furniture, the probable dimensions of the room, and the approximate location of the figure within it. Each observation was catalogued meticulously, like pieces of a puzzle awaiting assembly. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple undertook the next phase of her inquiry, situating the observed event within the wider context of the household. She began with what she knew of the family, their social standing, habits, and interpersonal dynamics. Families often revealed their truths in patterns. A casual remark here, a fleeting glance there, a habit that contradicted spoken statements. It was in these patterns, more than in any formal evidence, that Miss Marple placed her faith. She noted which family members might have motive, which circumstances might provide opportunity, and which interactions suggested hidden tensions. Already a web of possibilities began to emerge, delicate yet intricate, waiting to be examined further. Miss Marple also considered the staff of the household, the silent witnesses to daily life, often overlooked but keenly observant of the behavior of those around them. Housekeepers, maids, chauffeurs, and cooks frequently observed things unnoticed by their employers. Each could hold vital information, not always intentionally given but revealed through subtle gestures, offhand comments, or even the way tasks were performed. Miss Marple knew that one well-placed question could unlock these insights, and she planned her approach carefully. By evening, her mind had synthesized the morning's investigations with her own reflections. She considered the timeline of events, noting every possible opportunity for concealment or deception. She weighed the plausibility of Elspeth's vantage point against potential obstructions, and considered whether the act she had seen could have been staged or misinterpreted. Nothing escaped her attention: the architecture of the house, the likely movements of the inhabitants, the social rhythms of the household, and the subtleties of human emotion all formed part of a lattice upon which the truth might reveal itself. As darkness fell, Miss Marple prepared a modest meal, but her appetite was more intellectual than physical. Her thoughts wandered through the corridors of that distant house, through the rooms she had never seen, imagining the angles and lighting, the reactions of those present, the possible sequences that could lead to such a violent act. Each hypothesis was tested against the evidence she held, discarded if implausible, refined if promising, until a series of plausible scenarios began to crystallize in her mind. When the village quiet settled over St. Mary Mead, she retired to her chair once more, notebook in hand, and began to record her observations systematically. She traced the chain of events, noted potential suspects, and outlined avenues for further inquiry. Every detail, no matter how trivial it might appear to the casual observer, was assigned its proper weight, for Miss Marple understood that in the realm of human behavior, what seemed insignificant often held the key to revelation. Her thoughts lingered on the man seen from the train, whose identity remained unknown, and the act of violence he had suffered or perpetrated, a singular event witnessed by one, yet connecting countless threads of motive, opportunity, and consequence. She reflected on the lives intertwined within that household, on the subtleties of deception, on the masks people wore, and the fragile veneer of civility that so often concealed darker truths. Sleep eventually came, but it was restless and filled with fragmented images of windows, fleeting movements, and the distant rumble of a train. Miss Marple's subconscious continued its silent labor, arranging, testing, and discarding, always observing, always learning. She knew that the path to understanding was gradual, that each observation, each question, each patient inference would bring her closer to the truth, and she knew as she drifted into uneasy slumber that when the daylight returned, her work would begin in earnest, and the quiet village of St. Mary Mead would once again become a stage upon which the subtle art of detection could unfold. The morning light crept slowly across St. Mary Mead, filtering through the delicate lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, and with it came the gentle certainty of purpose that had become her companion in the days since Elspeth's revelation. Miss Marple had spent much of the night pondering the implications of that fleeting vision, the violence glimpsed through the train window, and the intricate web of possibilities it implied. The image of the man alone in the room, struck with sudden force, remained vivid in her mind, and she knew that uncovering the truth would require careful, methodical work, an understanding of human character as much as of circumstance. She dressed quietly, her movements deliberate, each action a continuation of the thought process that had occupied her waking hours. Even as she poured her morning tea, she traced with her mind the layout of the house she had never seen, imagining the angles, the rooms, and the potential for concealment. Every small detail, she reasoned, could prove critical. A misplaced object, an unusual habit, a contradiction in the recounting of events. These were the threads that, when woven together, would reveal the hidden pattern of human action. Her first task that morning was to follow up with Elspeth, whose observations remained the sole eyewitness account of the incident. Miss Marple walked briskly through the quiet village lanes, each step a rhythm in her contemplation. She had prepared a set of questions, not blunt or intrusive, but subtle prompts designed to elicit precise recollections. She understood that memory, especially if something sudden and alarming, could be capricious, and she intended to secure every nuance while it was still vivid. Elspeth greeted her with a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety, as though the act of speaking once more offered both reassurance and a reminder of the troubling vision. Miss Marple guided her gently, asking about the precise moments. The second the train had begun to pass the house, the reflection of light on glass, the position of furniture as glimpsed through a narrow window. Elspeth described them in detail, speaking slowly and deliberately, painting a mental image of a room suspended in a fraction of time, a room in which a singular act of violence had occurred, yet remained enigmatic in context. Miss Marple listened with patience and intent, absorbing every word, noting the slightest hesitation, the emphasis placed on certain features, and the subtle cues that spoke volumes about the reliability and interpretation of what was seen. In her mind, she began constructing a mental diagram, mapping the relative positions of the house, the room, the figure, and the objects within. It was a meticulous process, requiring both imagination and a disciplined approach to observation. Each detail, however minute, might serve as a key in unlocking the broader narrative hidden from ordinary view. Once the session with Elspeth concluded, Miss Marple returned to her own home, where she spread her notes and reflections across the small desk in her sitting room. She considered the household she sought to understand, the family whose lives intersected with the violence Elspeth had witnessed. Each member presented a potential facet of motive, opportunity, and possible concealment. Miss Marple reflected on the ordinary tensions that could mask extraordinary intentions: sibling rivalries, inheritance disputes, jealousies, and resentments that simmered beneath polite conversation. Families, she knew, were often arenas of subtle contest, and in such environments the smallest grievance could metastasize into acts of profound consequence. She decided that a direct, yet careful approach would be necessary. The staff of the household, often overlooked and underestimated, could hold crucial insights, their observations sharper than those of the family who assumed familiarity bred invisibility. Miss Marple formulated a plan: discreetly approach those who maintained close proximity to daily events, observe without intrusion, and gently probe for inconsistencies or signs of withheld information. Human nature, she had learned, rarely concealed all truths. It merely disguised them, leaving subtle traces for the perceptive to discern. By late morning, Miss Marple had prepared herself to visit the household in question, approaching not as an accuser, but as a concerned observer. She knew that the ordinary demeanor of a visitor could mask the intensity of inquiry beneath polite conversation. Her entry into the home would be unobtrusive, yet her senses attuned to every gesture, glance, and inflection, capturing layers of information imperceptible to those untrained in the art of observation. Upon arriving, she was greeted by the household's superficial calm, the polite acknowledgement of her presence, the faint background sounds of domestic routine, but beneath this veneer, she sensed the subtle tension that often precedes revelation. She engaged briefly in casual conversation, allowing her questions to appear incidental, masking the true purpose of her visit. Every response, measured and deliberate, was noted and analyzed. Every pause, every smile or frown, recorded in the quiet ledger of her mind. Miss Marple spent the afternoon observing and conversing, tracing the habitual movements of both family and staff. She watched how the housekeeper organized tasks, how the maids interacted with one another, and how subtle signs of anxiety or hesitation betrayed those who harbored knowledge yet sought to remain unnoticed. She noticed patterns of behavior, small deviations from routine, and most importantly, the intersections of action and reaction that revealed underlying tensions. Each observation built upon the last, a cumulative process through which clarity would emerge, as inevitably as light spreads across a room. By evening, she retreated to a quiet corner of the house to consolidate her thoughts. She reviewed her mental map, noting the sequence of movements, the likely positions of key figures during the moment of violence observed from the train, and the inconsistencies or peculiarities that might indicate concealment or deceit. Her approach was methodical. Every piece of evidence, every observed behavior, every fragment of recollection was placed within a framework, weighed for significance, and tested against possible scenarios. She knew that human nature was rarely linear. Motives intertwined, actions overlapped, and the truth often lay hidden in the intersections. As night deepened, Miss Marple reflected on the patterns emerging. The act witnessed by Elspeth was no isolated occurrence. It was part of a larger narrative, woven from subtle grievances, carefully managed appearances, and the perennial dance between intention and opportunity. She understood that patience, observation, and gentle inquiry would ultimately reveal what remained obscured, and that in the quiet hours ahead, further insight would come, shaped by her deliberate attention to human behavior and circumstance. Sleep came, though lightly, her mind still active, tracing the sequences of rooms, the angles of windows, the subtle cues of human interaction. Even in dreams, she continued to analyze, to organize, and to hypothesize, confident that when daylight returned, she would proceed with clarity, insight, and a measured resolve, drawing each thread of mystery into a coherent understanding that would bring the hidden events into light. The next morning brought a quiet chill to St. Mary Mead, a subtle reminder that spring, while advancing, still held moments of frost and lingering shadow. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and allowed herself a brief pause to observe the delicate interplay of light on her garden. Even the smallest details, the tilt of a branch, the glimmer of dew, the faint shadow of a passing bird, offered a rhythm to life that she found both grounding and instructive. Yet her thoughts were not on flora or fauna. They were entirely absorbed by the unfolding mystery, the thread of violence glimpsed from a distant train, and the complex network of human interactions that might have led to it. She had spent the previous days gathering impressions, mentally mapping the household and considering the potential motives, habits, and contradictions among the family and their staff. Now, however, it was time to transition from reflection to deliberate action. Patience, she reminded herself, was essential, but the clarity of insight required movement as well as thought. A careful, methodical approach would allow her to uncover not only what had occurred in that fleeting moment on the train, but also the human intentions and decisions that had led to it. After a simple breakfast, she prepared herself for a visit to the village post office, ostensibly to collect letters and greet acquaintances, but also to observe any ripples in social behavior that might provide further clues. Miss Marple knew that in small communities information traveled in subtle forms. A slip of the tongue, a glance held too long, or a remark that seemed casual yet contained a hidden significance. Each interaction offered an opportunity to detect the undercurrents of human conduct, the motivations and anxieties that often revealed far more than the words themselves. As she moved through the familiar streets, she noted how villagers paused, in conversation, subtly redirected their paths, and carried expressions that might otherwise have escaped notice. Nothing was too trivial to register. She catalogued each encounter, each small signal against the framework of the household she sought to understand. She imagined how these patterns might intersect with the dynamics of the family, the movements of the staff, and the circumstances that permitted the violent act to occur unseen by most yet witnessed by one. Returning home, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to review her mental notes, arranging them with the meticulous care of a scholar handling fragile manuscripts. Each observation, each fragment of remembered dialogue, and each inferred motive was set alongside every known fact of the household structure and routines. The visualization of the house from the vantage point of the train was now accompanied by her understanding of who was present, who had the opportunity, and who might benefit from the act that had been observed. The picture remained incomplete, but the outlines were emerging with increasing precision. In the afternoon, she set out to speak more deliberately with Elspeth, who had proven a steadfast witness and whose recollections were indispensable. This time, Miss Marple focused on timing and perspective, carefully reconstructing the sequence of moments from departure to the fleeting sighting. Elspeth's observations were precise, yet Miss Marple knew that memory was nuanced. What was emphasized might reveal subconscious impressions, and what was omitted might conceal anxiety, fear, or unrecognized significance. By cross-examining the sequence of visual cues and human actions, she could identify inconsistencies, clarify ambiguities, and detect the subtle traces of intention behind movement and posture. Elspeth described the positions of furniture, the faint reflection of light on polished surfaces, and the posture of the figure within the room, each observation sharpening the mental image that Miss Marple carried. With gentle prompts, she guided Elspeth to recall additional details: the movement of hands, the direction of gaze, and the interaction between objects and occupants. Each layer of recollection, subtle and often fleeting, added depth and complexity to the picture, allowing Miss Marple to anticipate possibilities and consider contingencies with remarkable clarity. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple turned her attention to practical observation. She visited nearby vantage points, small hills, fences, and paths that might provide an external perspective on the house in question. She considered how a passerby might see windows, shadows, or silhouettes, and how these perceptions could be misinterpreted or confirmed. By physically tracing potential lines of sight, she confirmed assumptions about the visual angles Elspeth had described, noting where light and obstruction might alter perception. Every detail was validated or questioned, ensuring that the narrative she built was anchored in plausible, observable fact rather than conjecture alone. Her next focus was the household itself. Arriving as quietly as one accustomed to blending into domestic spaces, she observed not merely through conversation, but through the subtler channels of behavior. She noted how staff moved, how they spoke with one another, and how their actions aligned or failed to align with the story as it had been recounted. Miss Marple knew that people rarely acted in isolation. Their conduct was often influenced by hidden tensions, unspoken alliances, and private anxieties. By tracking these minute indicators, she could infer not only what was happening on the surface but also what lay beneath, waiting to be discovered. Evening descended with a gradual softness, and Miss Marple allowed herself a short pause to reflect on the day's findings. Patterns were emerging, subtle but undeniable. The act witnessed from the train was no random event. It was the product of human intention and circumstance, woven into the ordinary flow of life with precision. Every habit, every tension, every opportunity for concealment was now catalogued in her mind, forming a lattice upon which the ultimate truth could be revealed. The interplay of human desire, fear, and routine was gradually yielding its secrets, though she knew full comprehension would require further observation and careful dialogue. Night fell fully, and the quiet of St. Mary Mead seemed almost palpable. Yet within that calm, Miss Marple's mind was fully engaged, tracing sequences, hypothesizing motives, and considering the intricate relationships that tied the household and its occupants together. Each movement, each glance, each subtle signal was a piece of the greater puzzle. She was not merely reconstructing an event. She was uncovering the architecture of human behavior itself, the invisible scaffolding that supported both crime and concealment. Sleep came eventually, though lightly, and even in dreams, Miss Marple's consciousness continued to probe, test, and analyze. She envisioned the rooms, the angles of sightlines, the interactions among family members and staff, and the single fateful moment observed by Elspeth. Every hypothesis was evaluated against the evidence, and every observation was assigned weight, significance, and plausibility. By morning, she knew, she would resume her careful work, drawing ever closer to clarity and the ultimate revelation of both act and actor. guided by the patient logic and unerring insight that had long defined her extraordinary understanding of human nature. The following morning dawned with a delicate gray light that diffused across the village, softening the edges of roofs, hedgerows, and winding lanes. Miss Marple, awake before the sun fully rose, felt the familiar stirrings of purpose that had accompanied her through countless puzzles and domestic intrigues. Her mind, already active, traced once again the fleeting glimpse of violence that had set her present investigation in motion. The image remained etched in her memory. A room, a figure, a movement that had been rapid yet laden with significance. She knew that unlocking the truth would require patience, careful observation, and an understanding not merely of facts but of human intention, subtlety, and misdirection. After a modest breakfast, she began her day with a deliberate walk through the village, the rhythm of her steps a meditative accompaniment to the mental mapping she performed with habitual precision. Even the smallest observations, the way a neighbor glanced over a fence, the cautious movement of a child retrieving a ball, the careful alignment of garden tools in a shed, became data points, indicators of the subtle currents of human behavior. She cataloged them all, aware that in small communities, patterns often repeated themselves, revealing hidden connections that might otherwise remain invisible. By mid-morning, she returned to Elspeth McGillicuddy, whose reliability as a witness remained invaluable. This session was focused on finer details: the trajectory of motion in the room observed from the train, the relative positions of furniture, the faint reflections of sunlight on polished surfaces, and the posture and expression of the figure whose actions had so unnerved her. Miss Marple encouraged Elspeth to imagine herself retracing the line of sight, to recall even the most transient impressions, and to describe the subtleties of the scene with as much precision as possible. These minor yet crucial details, when combined with observation and deduction, provided a framework upon which a comprehensive understanding could be built. Miss Marple's mind, however, was never satisfied with a single source of information. She knew that human perception was subject to bias, emotion, and momentary distraction. While Elspeth's testimony was both sincere and acute, it was necessary to corroborate and expand it with additional perspectives. Accordingly, she devised a plan to discreetly observe and engage with those who lived and worked within the household where the event had occurred. These individuals, often overlooked, held insights in the ordinary execution of daily tasks, the unguarded comments shared between staff, and the subtle interplay of routine and deviation. By the afternoon, she arrived at the household under the guise of polite social courtesy, though her purpose was precise and investigative. The house, superficially calm, revealed subtle tensions to the trained eye. Servants moved with measured caution. Glances were exchanged in quiet understanding, and the air seemed to hold an unspoken awareness that something extraordinary had occurred. Miss Marple, adept in reading such nuances, approached interactions with care, asking gentle, non-intrusive questions, observing responses, and noting discrepancies between words, actions, and expressions. Each small observation became part of the larger puzzle, gradually illuminating a landscape of motives, opportunities, and hidden truths. Her attention shifted first to the family's daily rhythm, the measured cadence of conversation, the alignment of tasks, and the habitual behaviors that often revealed subtle indicators of internal friction. Miss Marple observed which members were unusually alert, which hesitated, and which seemed oblivious. She recorded these patterns mentally, knowing that even a brief deviation from routine could signify awareness, guilt, or concealment. Likewise, the staff provided a contrasting lens through which to view the household's dynamics. Their loyalty, their subtle alliances, and their discreet observations of the family's behavior offered insights that Miss Marple cataloged meticulously, adding layers to her growing understanding of the event. As the day wore on, she began to consider the broader implications of what had been witnessed from the train. The single sudden act of violence was not isolated. It was embedded in a web of human interaction, opportunity, and design. Miss Marple traced the sequence of possibilities in her mind: who might have been present, who could have acted, and who stood to benefit. She imagined the chain of decisions that led to that moment, considering both intention and circumstance. Every angle, every line of sight, every interaction between individuals became part of a carefully structured hypothesis that she would continue to refine with further observation and inquiry. Evening arrived with a gentle quiet that contrasted the inner activity of Miss Marple's mind. She retired to her sitting room, assembling notes, observations, and recollections. The image from the train persisted, a focal point around which she structured her reasoning. She reviewed the angles, the probable positions of furniture, and the likely movements of all involved. She compared these reconstructions with the behavioral cues she had observed, searching for inconsistencies, hidden tensions, and subtle clues that might reveal the presence of motive or opportunity. Night descended fully, but sleep offered only partial respite. Miss Marple's thoughts continued their methodical work, arranging sequences, testing hypotheses, and imagining alternative scenarios. The faintest discrepancies, the smallest peculiarities became important elements in her internal analysis. She visualized the household as a stage, the inhabitants as actors whose gestures, hesitations, and glances conveyed more than words ever could. In dreams, she traced lines of sight, reconstructed sequences of motion, and contemplated the intricate balance of human emotion and circumstance that had led to the moment witnessed from the passing train. By the early hours, a pattern had begun to emerge, subtle, intricate, yet unmistakable. It was not merely the act itself, but the network of behaviors, interactions, and intentions that enveloped it, revealing the invisible threads that connected each individual to the event. Miss Marple understood that her work in the coming days would involve carefully testing these patterns, observing reactions, asking deliberate questions, and patiently waiting for the smallest cues to confirm or challenge her inferences. The process required both sensitivity and rigor, empathy and logic, and she was well accustomed to balancing these qualities in pursuit of truth. The village slept beneath a sky blurred with early morning mist, but within her quiet sitting room, Miss Marple continued her mental reconstruction, arranging every detail with precision and care. Each fragment of observation, each nuanced recollection, and each subtle insight was given its proper place within the framework of her understanding. She was neither hurried nor anxious. She knew that patience and meticulous attention to detail were the hallmarks of discovery, and as she finally allowed herself to rest for a brief period, she carried the certainty that the day to come would offer new opportunities for observation, fresh insights into human behavior, and incremental progress toward the revelation of what had truly transpired in that distant room, seen fleetingly from a train. The day began with the soft rustle of leaves in the early morning breeze, the village of St. Mary Mead wrapped in the delicate hush of dawn. Miss Marple, already awake and alert, moved quietly through her sitting room, her eyes tracing the familiar patterns of light and shadow that marked the start of a new day. Her thoughts, however, were far from the gentle domesticity around her. The fleeting glimpse of violence from the train persisted in her mind, a spark of mystery that had grown into a steadily burning inquiry. She knew that understanding what she had witnessed required more than observation. It demanded patient deduction, careful reconstruction, and an unerring attention to the subtleties of human behavior. After a brief breakfast, she began to plan her day with the precision of one accustomed to balancing observation, conversation, and deduction. The household at the center of the mystery remained her focal point, and she recognized that each visit, each casual inquiry, and each discreet observation could yield valuable insights. Patience, she reminded herself, was as vital as perception, for human nature rarely revealed itself fully in a single interaction. The smallest deviation in routine, the briefest hesitation, or the subtlest shift in tone could carry significance far beyond what appeared on the surface. Her first step was to retrace the path of her previous inquiries, consolidating the observations she had gathered over the past days. Elspeth McGillicuddy's testimony remained central. Its precision and reliability offered a foundation upon which further deductions could be built. Yet Miss Marple knew that reliance on a single perspective, however trustworthy, could only carry her so far. She needed corroboration from the environment itself, from the daily routines of the household, and from the interactions of its members, both family and staff. By mid-morning, she made her way to the household once more, entering under the guise of a friendly visitor, while her mind was fully engaged in analytical observation. The house greeted her with its usual surface calm, but beneath that veneer lay subtle currents of tension, unease, and anticipation. Servants moved with measured steps, conversations were careful and understated, and glances between individuals suggested unspoken communication. Miss Marple noted all of it, Recognizing that each gesture, however fleeting, could reveal truths hidden from casual eyes, she began with casual engagement, posing questions that seemed incidental, yet were carefully crafted to elicit subtle reactions. How long had a particular object remained in its place? What was the habitual timing of certain domestic tasks? Which members of the household appeared unusually alert, and which displayed signs of anxiety or distraction? Each response, each slight pause or inflection, became a data point in her growing map of the household's behavioral landscape. She understood that people often betrayed their own knowledge unintentionally, and that the truth frequently emerged through observation rather than direct questioning. Miss Marple spent much of the morning tracing patterns of routine. She observed the manner in which meals were prepared, the coordination between staff, and the small signals that passed between servants and family alike. Each routine, each repetition revealed both adherence and deviation, providing insight into who held knowledge, who acted with concealment, and who might be shielding information. Even the way a room was arranged, the positioning of objects, and the seemingly minor adjustments of furniture offered clues about the use and observation of space. These minute indicators, she knew, often held the key to understanding human intention. By afternoon, she turned her attention to the family members themselves. She observed how they interacted with one another, noting subtle shifts in tone, body language, and eye movement. Families, she reflected, were complex systems of loyalty, rivalry, and hidden grievances. Even when civility prevailed on the surface, undercurrents of competition, jealousy, and resentment could influence actions in ways that were almost imperceptible. Miss Marple catalogued these interactions, mentally linking them to the timeline of events, the opportunity for action, and the motives that might underlie the act of violence witnessed by Elspeth. Her observations extended to the minutiae of personal habits. A hesitation before answering a question, a glance toward a particular corner of the room, the manner in which a hand rested on a chair. Each movement was carefully noted. Miss Marple understood that human behavior, when observed systematically and empathetically, often revealed more than words alone could convey. The intersection of habit, opportunity, and motive created a lattice of human intention, and it was her task to interpret this lattice with patience and discernment. Evening approached with a quiet intensity, the fading light casting elongated shadows across the rooms and hallways. Miss Marple paused to consolidate her observations, considering both the environmental evidence and the behavioral cues she had collected. She visualized the room scene from the train, imagining the positioning of furniture, the potential movements of individuals, and the moments during which an act could occur. Each scenario was tested against the evidence she had gathered, and inconsistencies were noted for further inquiry. Nightfall brought no relief from thought. Miss Marple sat in her sitting room, notes and recollections spread before her as she traced the chain of human actions that could have led to the violent event. Her mind reconstructed sequences, analyzed deviations, and considered motives, always attentive to subtle signals that could guide her closer to understanding. She visualized the household as a living tableau, with each member and each servant positioned according to their habits, intentions, and interactions. The faintest gestures became as significant as spoken statements, revealing layers of intention and concealment that might otherwise remain hidden. Even in sleep, her mind continued its labor, weaving together observation, deduction, and imagination. She replayed interactions, reconstructed sequences, and tested hypotheses, knowing that the smallest revelation could unlock understanding of the broader mystery. By the early hours of the following morning, a pattern began to take shape, an intricate network of behavior, opportunity, and concealed motive, each element reinforcing the other, forming a framework upon which the truth could ultimately be revealed. Miss Marple understood that the days ahead would demand continued observation, careful questioning, and relentless attention to nuance. Yet she was confident, as always, in the power of patient deduction, in the reliability of human behavior as a source of insight, and in her own ability to discern the invisible threads connecting action to consequence. The path to discovery was gradual, deliberate, and intricate, but it was a path she had traversed countless times, guided by a steady intuition, rigorous reasoning, and an unerring attention to the details that most overlooked. And as the village slept beneath the silvered light of early dawn, Miss Marple prepared herself for the careful unraveling of the mystery that had begun with a fleeting glimpse from a train window, determined to follow each thread to its ultimate conclusion. The day broke over St. Mary Mead with an almost imperceptible shift in light, the early morning sun casting long, delicate shadows across the narrow village streets. Miss Marple, as always, was awake before the village stirred, sitting quietly in her favorite chair with a cup of tea warming her hands and her thoughts fully occupied with the mystery that had so recently entered her life. The image of the violent act glimpsed from the passing train remained vivid in her mind, its fleeting nature only sharpening the need for careful reconstruction. She had spent days observing, questioning, and piecing together fragments of human behavior, and now, with each passing moment, the threads of understanding were beginning to entwine into something approaching clarity. She dressed methodically, noting even in this small domestic act the importance of routine. Order, she reflected, often mirrored intention, and a well-ordered morning could serve as a mental framework for the day's analytical work. Each movement, each deliberate step, was part of the process, preparing her mind, focusing her attention, and sharpening her perceptive faculties for the observations to come. By the time she stepped into the quiet streets, the village was beginning to awaken, its gentle bustle offering subtle cues of social rhythm, human habit, and underlying tensions. Her first visit that day was to Elspeth McGillicuddy, whose testimony had remained the cornerstone of her investigation. This session focused on refining temporal details and subtle visual cues, reconstructing the fleeting moments from departure to the sighting with meticulous care. Elspeth's descriptions, while already precise, were probed for nuance, the angle of the sunlight, the exact position of furniture, the posture and expression of the figure, and the interplay of light and shadow within the room. Miss Marple guided her gently, allowing Elspeth to explore her memory in layers, and with each refinement, the mental reconstruction of the event became more detailed and accurate. With the immediate visual evidence reinforced, Miss Marple turned her attention to the environment surrounding the household. She moved through the nearby paths, fences, and fields, retracing sight lines and angles that might correspond with Elspeth's observation. The house, she noted, was positioned in such a way that a single window provided a fleeting glimpse of the interior from the passing train. The alignment of trees, shrubs, and fencing influenced visibility, creating opportunities for observation while also concealing certain actions. Each step she took in this careful mapping process revealed possibilities and limitations, shaping the framework of what could have occurred and when. By mid-morning, Miss Marple entered the household under the guise of a friendly social call. The surface calm of the house belied subtle undercurrents of tension, glances exchanged in fleeting recognition, minor hesitations in speech, and slight adjustments of posture that betrayed awareness of her presence. She observed all of it with patient attention, recognizing that human behavior often revealed itself more through the unintended than the deliberate. The manner in which staff moved, conversed, and managed routine tasks offered as much insight as the words exchanged in polite conversation. Each subtle deviation from habit became a potential clue, each nuanced gesture a piece of the broader puzzle. Miss Marple began to weave together her observations, creating mental linkages between environmental layout, behavioral patterns, and the fleeting act witnessed by Elspeth. She noted the interactions among family members, their habitual tendencies, and the ways in which minor tensions could escalate into concealment or complicity. The household, she realized, functioned as a living system, each individual's behavior influenced by those around them, by the routines they followed, and by the secrets they sought to protect. Her role was to discern these hidden currents, to trace them from surface behavior to motive and action, and to identify where the pivotal moment, the act of violence, had occurred within this complex web. By afternoon, Miss Marple had compiled a mental map of probable movements, noting windows, corridors, furniture placement, and potential witness positions. She imagined the sequence of events, considering alternative scenarios and testing each against her observations. Which actions were physically plausible? Which were psychologically consistent with known behaviors? Who might have had motive and opportunity? And how would these factors intersect in the confined and carefully structured environment of the house? Each question, each consideration was catalogued with meticulous care, forming the latticework upon which understanding could be built. Evening brought a new layer of inquiry. Miss Marple spent time in quiet reflection, reviewing interactions observed earlier, the subtle signals exchanged among staff, and the behavioral nuances of family members. She considered the alignment of opportunity and intention, noting which elements were confirmed, which required further validation, and which might be misdirection. She reflected on human nature, the habitual blending of truth and concealment, the unspoken communication that often revealed more than spoken words, and the precise circumstances that allowed one single act to occur unnoticed by most, yet observed by one. As night descended, she sat in her sitting room with a notebook, recording insights, tracing sequences, and testing hypotheses. Every detail was placed in context, every subtle observation examined for relevance. The room glimpsed from the train became increasingly tangible in her mind, its dimensions, angles, and occupants mapped with clarity. She visualized the positions of individuals, the timing of movement, and the interplay between intention and action. Each scenario was scrutinized, refined, and tested against the evidence of human behavior she had painstakingly observed. Sleep came lightly, filled with fragments of rooms, movements, and interactions. Even in dreams, Miss Marple continued her methodical reconstruction, testing alternative possibilities, considering hidden motives, and tracing lines of observation. She understood that the revelation of truth was gradual, emerging through careful synthesis of observation, deduction, and intuition. The process required patience, empathy, and rigorous attention to detail, a balance she had honed over decades of quietly observing human nature. By early morning, patterns were becoming more evident. The act witnessed from the train was not an isolated occurrence, but the culmination of a network of human intentions, opportunities, and concealed actions. Miss Marple recognized that further observation, carefully guided inquiry, and patient reflection would bring these threads into sharper relief, ultimately revealing not merely what had occurred but why and how it had been concealed. She felt the quiet satisfaction of approaching clarity, knowing that each day, each observation, and each subtle insight contributed incrementally toward the ultimate understanding of the event and its participants. Morning settled gently over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in soft hues of gold and silver. Miss Marple rose as the first faint light touched her sitting room, her mind already occupied with the puzzle that had quietly infiltrated her daily life. The fleeting act of violence observed from the train lingered persistently in her thoughts, and she recognized that the threads she had begun to trace in previous days were converging, though not yet fully revealed. Every detail, every subtle gesture, and every habitual movement held significance, and she approached the day with the calm intensity of one accustomed to piecing together human motives from observation, deduction, and intuition. After her morning routine, she took her cup of tea to the window, observing the village streets as they slowly awakened. Each villager's behavior, however mundane it might appear, was a potential clue. A hurried step, a glance over the shoulder, a hesitation in conversation. Miss Marple cataloged these with the quiet precision that had guided her investigations for decades. Human nature, she reflected, revealed itself in patterns, and these patterns often connected in ways invisible to the untrained eye. Today, she intended to uncover more of those hidden connections, using both Elspeth's testimony and her own careful observations as guides. Her first visit of the day was, as ever, to Elspeth McGillicuddy. Miss Marple sought to refine and expand the witness's recollection, focusing on minute details that might clarify spatial relationships, timing, and behavior within the household. The alignment of furniture, the direction of sunlight, and even the faint reflections on polished surfaces were all considered in reconstructing the scene from the train. Miss Marple encouraged Elspeth to describe not only what she saw, but also how she perceived it, the impressions of movement, posture, and expression that remained vivid in memory. These subtle cues were invaluable, offering a framework for the events she sought to understand more fully. By mid-morning, Miss Marple moved to observe the household environment directly. Approaching under the guise of a polite visitor, she immersed herself in the subtle rhythms of domestic life. Servants moved with habitual precision, family members followed established routines, and every glance, gesture, and inflection was noted for its potential significance. Miss Marple recognized that human behavior, especially within a domestic setting, rarely revealed its secrets outright. It was in hesitation, in minor deviations from routine, and in unspoken exchanges that the truth often lay hidden. She began by observing the staff, Their interactions, small corrections and occasional whispers provided insight into alliances, loyalties, and knowledge that might otherwise remain concealed. Miss Marple noted which members were unusually alert or nervous, which seemed to act with deliberate care, and which betrayed subtle awareness of circumstances beyond the apparent. Each observation built upon the last, forming a lattice of behavioral evidence that could later be cross-referenced with her mental reconstruction of the event. Afternoon brought her focus to the family members themselves. She watched how they spoke with one another, the nuances in tone, the posture they adopted, and the small, often unconscious gestures that betrayed emotion. Families, she reflected, were intricate systems. Loyalty, rivalry, resentment, and affection intertwined in ways that were rarely visible but profoundly influential. By cataloging these interactions, Miss Marple constructed a dynamic map of human intention and susceptibility to concealment, testing her emerging hypotheses against observed behavior. Later, she explored the physical layout of the household, moving through rooms, corridors, and vantage points to understand how space influenced visibility and movement. The line of sight from the window observed by Elspeth was examined, and Miss Marple considered how light, reflection, and obstruction might alter perception. She envisioned possible sequences of movement, imagining how a figure could act without detection, where concealment was plausible, and where an inadvertent witness might be positioned. Each consideration refined her understanding of the probable scenario and the human dynamics at play. Evening approached with a growing sense of anticipation. Miss Marple returned to her sitting room, spreading notes, observations, and sketches before her. She traced sequences of action, analyzed behavioral cues, and tested alternative explanations. The act witnessed from the train was no longer an isolated incident in her mind. It was the culmination of opportunity, motive, and concealed action, embedded within the habitual patterns of household life. By systematically aligning the behavior of each individual with the spatial and temporal framework she had reconstructed, Miss Marple began to see connections that were invisible to the casual observer. As darkness settled, she reviewed her findings with methodical care. Every minor inconsistency, every hesitation, and every deviation from routine was considered for its potential significance. She visualized the room in question, imagining movements, sequences, and interactions, testing which actions were consistent with observed behavior and which required further inquiry. Her reasoning was both patient and rigorous, relying on the subtle interplay of human intention and circumstance to reveal what remained hidden. Night arrived, but sleep provided little relief. Miss Marple's mind continued to process observations, reconstruct sequences, and refine hypotheses. She imagined every plausible path from opportunity to action, considering the motivations and constraints of each individual involved. Even in rest, she traced sightlines, mapped interactions, and mentally cataloged human behavior, confident that her methodical approach would soon bring clarity. By the early hours, emerging patterns suggested not only who might have acted, but also the subtle factors that had allowed the act to remain unnoticed, save for the fleeting glimpse from a passing train. Miss Marple understood that the coming days would require further observation, careful questioning, and the patient piecing together of nuanced evidence. Yet she felt a quiet assurance born of experience that the structure of human behavior, once carefully observed, would yield the truth. The mystery that had begun with a sudden, fleeting act of violence was gradually revealing itself, each fragment of observation and deduction bringing her closer to the ultimate understanding of both event and actor. She allowed herself a brief pause, knowing that methodical patience, attentive observation, and careful synthesis would soon illuminate the hidden workings of the household and the human intentions that had shaped that fateful day. The morning light filtered softly into St. Mary Mead, lending the village a tranquil and almost deceptive calm. Miss Marple, awake before the day had fully begun, moved quietly through her sitting room, her thoughts once again drawn to the fleeting image she had observed from the train, a sudden violent act suspended in time yet pregnant with meaning. Though days had passed since the initial observation, the details remained vivid, and her methodical mind had not ceased its careful reconstruction. Every subtle gesture, every hint of deviation from routine, and every minor human expression was a thread she intended to follow with patience and precision. She began her morning with a quiet cup of tea, taking note of the subtle sounds of the village awakening, the distant clatter of a cart, the soft cooing of birds, the faint murmur of early conversation. To Miss Marple, these ordinary rhythms held significance, revealing patterns and predictabilities in human behavior that mirrored in miniature the larger dynamics she sought to understand within the household at the center of her investigation. Human nature, she knew, revealed itself in both action and omission, in the smallest movements as well as the most deliberate gestures. Her first engagement of the day was, as always, with Elspeth McGillicuddy. Miss Marple intended to refine the witness's recollection further, focusing on the subtleties of perception, the angle of vision from the train window, the reflection of light, the positioning of furniture, and the posture of the individual whose action had been glimpsed. Elspeth, still understandably affected by what she had seen, was guided gently by Miss Marple, encouraged to explore the impressions and micro-details that memory often preserves even when conscious attention may not. With each refinement, the mental reconstruction of the event became more vivid, more precise, and increasingly useful for hypothesis testing. By late morning, Miss Marple set out to observe the household itself, moving through the familiar lanes with quiet purpose. She entered the home under the guise of polite social courtesy, but her attention was fully engaged in careful observation. Surface calm reigned in the household, yet Miss Marple immediately perceived the subtle undercurrents, the glances exchanged, the brief hesitations in speech, the small adjustments of posture that betrayed unspoken awareness. Each of these minor indicators was catalogued mentally, forming a nuanced map of potential knowledge, intention, and concealment within the house. Her observations began with the staff, whose habitual routines and informal communications often revealed more than the carefully controlled behavior of the family. She noted subtle signals, a hurried glance, a slight delay in responding, an exchange of whispered words. These, she recognized, were the signposts of awareness, loyalty, and hidden information. Each observation reinforced her growing understanding of the household as a network of interconnected behaviors, each influencing and revealing the other, in ways that were not immediately obvious to casual observers. Afternoon brought her focus to the family members themselves. She watched how they interacted with one another, noting micro-expressions, tones of voice, and the ways in which they managed appearances in each other's presence. Families, Miss Marple reflected, were complex systems in which loyalty, rivalry, and resentment were often intertwined, with subtle behaviors revealing motives or the concealment of them. By cataloging these interactions, she could trace lines of influence and infer probable behaviors, gradually constructing a framework that explained not only the act witnessed, but also the circumstances that made it possible. Miss Marple then turned to spatial analysis, moving through rooms, corridors, and vantage points to understand the physical layout of the house and the possibilities it afforded for observation, movement, and concealment. She envisioned sequences of action, how an individual could move through the rooms where concealment was possible, where observation might be unintended yet unavoidable. Each consideration was weighed against the behavioral cues she had recorded, building a matrix of probability for the act and for the responses of those who might have observed or contributed to it. Evening brought a period of reflection in the quiet of her sitting room. Miss Marple spread her mental notes across the framework of the household, aligning observations of behavior with the reconstructed timeline of the event. Minor inconsistencies were scrutinized for significance. Habitual deviations were considered for their potential explanatory power. The act itself, once fleeting and nearly intangible, began to occupy a clear and structured space in her reasoning, its occurrence explained not merely by opportunity, but by the web of human motivations, constraints, and concealed knowledge. As night settled, her thoughts continued to work in the stillness. She envisioned interactions, sequences of movement, and hidden communications within the household. Each individual was placed within the context of behavior, motive, and opportunity. Even the smallest gestures were considered for significance. A hand resting momentarily on a table, a glance toward a closed door, a hesitation before speaking. Every micro-expression and subtle movement could provide confirmation, contradiction, or a new line of inquiry. Miss Marple allowed herself to drift into a light sleep, yet her mind remained active. piecing together sequences and testing scenarios against her accumulated knowledge. By the early hours of the next morning, patterns began to solidify. The act witnessed from the train was revealed not as a random moment, but as the convergence of intention, opportunity, and human psychology, carefully masked by routine and expectation. Miss Marple understood that the culmination of her inquiry would require patient observation, careful questioning, and the synthesis of all the subtle cues she had painstakingly collected. She was confident that the truth, though concealed by human habit and intention, was accessible through careful, methodical reasoning, and that each day brought her closer to the ultimate revelation. The first light of morning in St. Mary Mead carried a quiet promise, softening the outlines of cottages and hedgerows with a delicate glow. Miss Marple, already awake and alert, moved through her sitting room with her habitual precision, each small action, pouring tea, arranging her notes, reviewing observations, serving as both ritual and preparation. The mystery that had been steadily unfolding over weeks now occupied the full breadth of her attention, and the fleeting act glimpsed from the train remained vivid in her mind, a focal point around which her reasoning and observation continued to turn. Every detail, every gesture, and every nuance mattered, for in the convergence of subtle human behavior and opportunity lay the path to understanding. She began the day by revisiting her prior reconstructions, mentally tracing the line of sight from the train window, the spatial arrangements of the household, and the observed behaviors of family and staff. These mental exercises were as essential as any physical observation, allowing her to test the plausibility of various scenarios, anticipate potential inconsistencies, and refine her hypotheses. Each iteration brought her closer to clarity, each adjustment revealing connections previously obscured by minor oversights or unexamined assumptions. By mid-morning, Miss Marple set out toward the household in question, her steps deliberate, her mind fully engaged. The surface of domestic life, she knew, could conceal layers of complexity, and it was within these layers that the truth was hidden. Upon arrival, she was greeted by the usual polite civility, but beneath it, subtle signs of tension and awareness were evident. A pause before responding to a question, a glance exchanged between staff, the careful management of movement within the rooms. Each of these indicators was catalogued, forming a rich tapestry of human behavior upon which she could overlay her reconstructed timeline of the event. Miss Marple's attention first fell upon the household staff, whose routines and informal interactions often revealed more than the carefully managed behavior of the family. She observed the precision with which they moved, the timing of tasks, and the nuanced exchanges that passed unnoticed by casual observers. Each gesture, each hesitation, each micro-expression contributed to a mental map of knowledge, intent, and concealed information. In these subtleties, Miss Marple discerned the outlines of opportunity, noting which individuals had access, awareness, and potential motive, and which were merely instruments of routine. By afternoon, her focus shifted to the family members themselves. She studied their interactions, noting the alignment of speech, gesture, and posture with habitual patterns. Families, she reflected, were complex systems of competing interests and loyalties, often revealing intentions through subtle contradictions rather than overt statements. Miss Marple catalogued each nuance, a delayed reply, a glance toward a closed door, the slight adjustment of posture. These fragments of behavior, once assembled, created a lattice of human intention, revealing likely actions, concealed motives, and the possibilities for observation or deception. She next turned to the spatial dynamics of the household. Walking through rooms, corridors, and vantage points, Miss Marple examined sightlines, obstacles, and opportunities for concealment. She visualized sequences of movement, imagining how the act observed from the train could have unfolded and which paths were physically and behaviorally plausible. Each scenario was tested against her accumulated observations, highlighting consistencies, contradictions, and points requiring further scrutiny. Her mental reconstruction was now intricate, linking environment, human behavior, and temporal sequence into a coherent framework that explained not only the act itself but the hidden mechanics of its concealment. Evening brought a reflective interlude. Miss Marple sat quietly with her notes, tracing sequences, reviewing behavioral cues, and testing hypotheses. She considered the alignment of opportunity, motive, and concealment, how each individual's position, habit, and intention intersected with the fleeting moment observed from the train. Minor inconsistencies were examined for their potential explanatory value. Habitual deviations scrutinized for insight. The household in her mind had become a living diagram of human interaction, revealing pathways of action, observation, and concealment that only careful synthesis could elucidate. Night deepened, yet Miss Marple's mind remained engaged. She reconstructed interactions, revisited lines of sight, and considered human motives and constraints. Each subtle gesture, glance, and hesitancy was tested against her framework of probable events. The act itself, once ephemeral, now occupied a clear and structured place in her reasoning. She imagined each individual's perspective, the timing of their movements, and the likelihood of awareness or complicity. Her mental exercise combined environmental observation, behavioral nuance, and logical deduction, bringing coherence to what had initially appeared as a fleeting, nearly incomprehensible moment. By the early hours, patterns were emerging with increasing clarity. The act observed from the train revealed itself not as random, but as the convergence of human intention, opportunity, and habitual concealment. Miss Marple recognized that the culmination of her inquiry required both patience and precision. Further observation, careful questioning, and verification of behavioral cues would allow her to confirm the truth she had now nearly discerned. Every day, each observation and each minute insight brought her closer to unraveling the complex web of human interaction that had produced the event, ensuring that the final revelation would be complete, accurate, and grounded in the subtle realities of human nature.